I think we're a bit haunted. I'm Sarah Davison, the president of the East Hampton Library, and I'm thrilled to welcome you here for the last of our Tom Twomey lecture series of the year. And before I say anything else, I want to thank Chip Ray and the committee who put together this year's wonderful lecture series. I also want to thank Dennis Fabzak, the director of the library, and his team for all their help with this lecture series, setting up and getting the AV going, and LTV, who's been recording these lecture series for us and projecting them. So we have a great treat in store. We're going to learn about Charles Addams and his lugubrious world, and Kevin Mizrahi is the director of the T. and Charles Addams Foundation. I had the great pleasure of knowing Charles and T. Addams myself as a person who worked at ARF, and T. and Charles raised the funds to build the original shelter. And it was great fun to work with them and go to their house, the Swamp, which is now the office and headquarters of the foundation. So Kevin, come on up and give us a treat.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And I also would like to thank Adrian Katea for reintroducing me to Sheila Rogers probably 10 years ago, and then Sheila in turn called me in January, I think it was, or emailed me about this possibility of this event. And it was the most bizarre thing because Judith Hope was on the same little ferry from the same resort we were staying in, and I thought it was Judith Hope. It's not on? Oh, you can hear me back there anyway. Except it's not recording. It's on orange. Press it once. It's on green again. Okay. He said it would do that. Anyway, it was meant to be, I would say, except that it seemed like that was the end of January, and here it is October, and I have no way of figuring out how we got there. This is just so fast. So, to introduce you to Charlie, I need to show you that this obviously is Chaz Addams, one of his works of the Addams family, but this was how this nasty little boy started out in 1912 as a real cutie pie. And he was born in Westfield, New Jersey, and he never changed. If any of you knew him, he looks absolutely the same smile. I mean, some of us do, but he just looks the same impish thing that charmed every single man and woman who he was friends with. Sorry? Oh, answering everybody. And Charlie really was so interested in what was going on beneath the ground as a child. He lived in Westfield, a place that's just still today filled with Gothic homes, huge old homes, and Westfield is kind of tucked away, you'd never even know it's there. He would go to the cemetery on his way to school and try to figure out what was going on beneath the ground. So this started really early. And this is not some tale of lore. He actually told me this, that he and T would continue this event by going cross-country in the van they had and stop in Civil War cemeteries across the country and other military cemeteries with the same thought in mind, to investigate cemeteries, headstones. I guess it was part of his homework. Charlie did end up getting married. This is his first wife, who of course everyone would say, oh my God, of course Morticia, he made her Morticia. And Charlie's deal was that he married 3 women who all resembled something that he really worshipped, which was that look. This young woman was Barbara Day from Westfield, New Jersey. And this is an early photograph of them, and Charlie has that, I don't know, he looks like a gangster. There's something about in his early pictures that are very tough looking, and he's really a sweet person. This photograph was done by William Penn, and I There is a second wife, and I'm not even going to honor her with a picture. So there was T. The second wife was a hideous person, unfortunately. Married him for the wrong reasons and abused him to the point of cutting up his artwork, torturing him enough to divorce her. But it was a stepping stone marriage so she could become married to a lord. And she hoodwinked the lord as well as she hoodwinked Charlie, so the rest is history. But this is T. Addams. And they were boyfriend, girlfriend, while they were both married to other people. Just close friends. I think he was even in the hospital when she was having her first child. So I don't ask the particulars of how really close they were, but they were very close. And then all the years later, I'm talking about the 40s, they did not marry until the 80s because he had some carotid blockage and things like that, and she was living with him but had no, if you remember the late 70s, she was treated as chattel, so she could not answer for him, she couldn't say yes for surgery, talk to doctors, nothing. So they did eventually marry. And they married in T's pet cemetery in Watermill, where she had her house. So Charlie, it was by two Supreme Court judges who came and married them. Their friends came to the house to have a cocktail party. It was Memorial Day weekend. No one said a word, and then they show up with their wedding party all in black and got married. And Charlie had sunglasses. He had had some eye surgery. And so he really looked like a hood then. It was wonderful. So he celebrated this he did two different drawings of this particular piece. This is them in real life. And as you can see behind them are some sculptural things. It's a pet cemetery in Watermill. When T bought the place in Sagaponack, my partner and I had to move all of the dog and cat graves or jars and dig them all up and move them to Sagaponack from their cemetery. So that was a very Addams. If he had been alive, there would have been a drawing for that, for sure. I'm just going to read something about his work. This is a quote that Charlie did. Much of what I'm showing you today is really published in the New Yorker. It wasn't the only place he published, but it did have the right of first refusal from 1938 when he really published his first full drawing. So anything he wanted to do with drawings after that, he could go anywhere he wanted, which he did. He was published also in syndicated newspapers across the country. So it wasn't just the New Yorker, but if you want to get published somewhere, the New Yorker was why he wanted to get into New York from New Jersey anyway. So this, sorry. Oh, I'm looking at the computer, it has a different picture on it. This was a cover of the New Yorker. It's called Sheep Clouds. I just want to read what he wrote because I can't do this verbatim. Doodling is one method of getting ideas. You sit there with a blank piece of paper and make doodles. And one thing relates to another in a strange sort of way, and then you get the idea. I think about 60% start this way. Once I drew a little hillside full of grazing sheep that in the distance become clouds rising into the sky. After lying fallow for 2 years, it became a New Yorker cover with minor changes. Sheep clouds. I sketch ideas with a wolf pencil and paper stump for a quick effect, but all the work is there. You've composed it and done everything. Maybe later you check a book on medievalism to get a window just right. The finished drawing is done in wash and India ink, which provides the atmosphere I really need for my ideas. Economy is always important to me. I think my best work is a single panel with no caption. And that is something he strived to do his entire life, was to give you a cartoon that had no caption and not have to over-explain the joke intended. This was the very first cartoon that was published in the New Yorker, so you can see, he was very young. It's a line drawing. There's no shading, there's no nothing. His signature isn't even what he eventually tried out many times over. And this was 1938. Oh no, 33, sorry. 38 was something else. And this too, shortly after that, followed. Can you all see those captions in there? I realize they might be a little low on the screen. No. I just wanted the room tinted a light buff. And this too. I kind of grouped some things together. This is Dr. Carberry has been showing much more originality in his sermons lately, hasn't he? Now, this particular drawing is from 1936, Mona Lisa at the Met. And now he's starting to play with ink and washes and a little different attitude about the art itself of his cartoons. Plus, he's starting to play with his signature and calling himself Chaz. I mean, friends from school and growing up in New Jersey had different nicknames, Chill and things like that, and he was called Chuck by some people and Charlie by others. I mean, he was always Charlie, as far as I was concerned. He was always Charlie to wife number 1 and wife number 3, but wife number 2 affected the British sensibilities that she thought she was going for, and always called him Charles, with a very long, drawn-out Charles. I mean, she was a horror. Just unbelievable. And this one, this is 1937. This is his first attempt at getting into that haunted house that we all now associate with the month of October and Charles Addams and the Addams family. There was some interest in the dilapidation. It had a lot to do with Westfield because of the number of houses that were falling apart and were not lived in. And Charlie frequented them a lot, not breaking in, but just traveling through the houses and fascinated by the interiors and the exteriors because he lived in a rather normal house, relatively speaking. One of his biggest recurring themes was about murder, mayhem, and this sort of started that on that ball rolling with this one seems about the right size. And this sort of haunted person. He changed the characters each time, but there was always a bit of an oddity in one of the characters if it had to do with murder. And then always the straight guy. The Bud Abbott and the Lou Costello were in every single one of his drawings. And he became, I think that's what nailed him the #1 spot at the New Yorker during his day. Again, marriage to a second woman who was making him crazy. This sort of situation, we did an entire book on relationships because he certainly knew what he was talking about. And enjoyed all of it, but liked to report it. Again, you know, she's, and today we would say, what is that all about? But it's widow's weeds. That's what that veil is, for those of us who are too young to know about that. Again, with relationships, I mean, George dropped the keys. It's much more important she'll be stuck at the beach than it is that the bird has taken him away. And this again starts his fascination, and also about the same time that he moved to West Hampton Beach, not moved to, but bought a summer house and lived right in the dunes, right on the other side of the dunes. It was a beautiful old estate that had been washed away by the hurricane of '38, and he was living in the stables. The stables were turned into a wonderful guest house. It was beautiful. Stalls for the kitchen, for the dining room. They left all those and just whitewashed everything. This is another one with no caption. Very proud of it. The Colosseum, I mean, he did a beautiful job, so he's unusually painterly, not just a cartoonist, but had a real talent for his craft. This lovely lady says, but why do I need a license? It's only for use around the house. And again, I mean, this is done at the same time as the Colosseum, and yet he loved doing kind of sketchy things and, you know, changing it, not doing everything looking so finished. but a good swath of wash on it, and he was done, if he got the idea across. On the same element with the department store, he has this lovely way asking for where blunt instruments are. And he also loved to paint and draw his women to be large and tough with big piano legs, and their husbands were always a good 1.5 feet shorter. And Charlie liked to say it was from just pounding them into the ground. He always had the husbands as the nice little polite dentist, the accountant, the whatever, and the wife was just miserable. This is a lot later, but subtle. He's in the garden. There she is. And there he is. And then sometimes he would get even. But mostly not. Mostly it was about her, but very often there's some cartoons of him trying to have the husband get to the equal ground on it. This one became one of the more famous Addams drawings because it was so bizarre and it was so unexplainable. We have a letter from an asylum in Ohio that thanked him for the use of this drawing because it became almost like the Rorschach test where you say, what does this shape mean to you? They used this as the sort of like an entrance exam. If you had trouble answering this, they had a bed for you right in the front window. But I mean, it's amazing to have a letter saying, thank you so much for allowing us to use this. And in fact, it was so popular, I think he did 11 of these and sold them to people, fans who would write in for $25. You know, that was about the going rate. He was a cartoonist, and now illustration art is every bit as important as the great masters in one sense. Not quite up there, but getting there. He also was fascinated with arms and armor, and of course, torture devices. And so this garage sale sort of exemplifies what he used to see. This looks just like his garage in West Hampton Beach. That's what's so funny. He had two-car garage. And his fascination ended up gaining him an enormous collection of weaponry, suits of armor. He kept them in New York in his apartment. He had, I think, 20 crossbows up on the walls. I remember going to the apartment once, and I asked him, have you ever shot any of these? And he did have some fixed up and repaired. He said, sure, this one really works. And it's probably 12th century. Steel cables, took it down, put an arrow in it, and it went right through the kitchen door into the wall. And I thought, wow, you're amazing. On the same, sensibility, abdicating, everything must go. So all the important weaponry is there. When Charlie died, T was required by his will to have all the weaponry auctioned, all his collections, because collectors should have it. He used to find them in junk stores in Lower Manhattan. I mean, there was no call for buying a crossbow or a gauntlet, and he collected them. So they did very well. It was Sotheby's did the auction. I think it was $300,000 worth of stuff by the time they were all said and done. His fascination with castles went with the weaponry. This is to think we went to all that trouble and not a single foe showed up. And the service entrance to the castle, of course. This is an example of one that never got made into a final cartoon. And it's the executioner, when it stops being fun, I'll quit. So this is a perfect example of what he talked about in that quote I read, that he used a charcoal pencil, a wolf pencil, and a stub. It's like rolled up paper, and it just make that quick smudge Then he would take it into the meetings on Wednesdays at the New Yorker, and if they said yay, he would go home and really work it up to a finished drawing. And if not, he would either finish it himself and publish it somewhere else, or as we found out, we had probably 1,500 of these unpublished drawings in a box in the attic. So we now are actually publishing some of them in books. And here's another about the executioner. This had to do with a Chase Manhattan Bank ad that said you can, work on your nest egg. And Charlie's was you can take it with you. And that's it. He also loved vintage sports cars and collected them, probably in his lifetime, maybe 20, 25 cars, not all at once. But he did own 2 Bugattis, and he didn't have a lot of money. At that time, you could buy a Bugatti because it was nothing. Now that particular one is owned by someone in Italy, so it's gone back and forth 3 times, I think. Also, the forever after was a fascination for him that has to do with sitting in the cemetery. So this has the express line for 6 sins or less, which has 20 people in it. And again, this is where the washes with his skies are amazing. When you see the drawings, I mean, this is a good size to see it broadcast. You think that these were in the New Yorker, they were 3 inches by 2 inches maybe. You didn't see any of the detail. And he really had quite a good craft there. Here again, the Styx ferry chartered. And all the people on it, of course, are all business people. They're on their way down. He did probably a dozen different cemetery, chairs and the man's best friend, all of these things with headstones. This one with cellar doors. And this mausoleum has a service entrance. And then, not to be undone, this is a really late cartoon, but with honk if you believe in reincarnation. He and T both loved animals. As Sarah Davison told you, they did a lot with ARF. T knew the watering hole people, where to get the money. I worked with T to do fundraising packages. We went off to New York and presented them to people who had foundations and got a pretty decent amount of money. She had a really good friend who bought the property in Waynescott, donated that. Charlie just gave any bit of artwork was always free to them. And T loved birds so much that he did this in her behalf. Well, you wanted a place with more birds than people. Obviously, she's a little concerned about it. In the same vein, there's always one witness. One doesn't know and the other does. And it's just the same as the situation for this. The Notre Dame. He was especially proud of this too, the French countryside off Paris. I mean, and again, only one witness that something bad is going to happen here. This was a New Yorker cover also. I think it's, I didn't have the year, sorry. Not sure. This one's really interesting because this went on during it's 1942, and I am going to have to read these details because this is his version of a blue willow plate, which I'm sure probably 2/3 of the room know what that is and maybe part don't, but it was the Thomas Minton original pattern, which illustrated an ancient Chinese tale of boy meets girl, girl's father finds boy unfit to wed. In preference to a rich suitor, boy and girl run away to an island refuge on her wedding night. To the rich man takes revenge years later and has them executed, at which time they are turned into doves by the loving gods. All of those things were reported on this plate. So Charlie changed it to, because it was a Sino-Japanese war, he replaced the items with his own wartime themes, which were the fence that the future bride's father built to keep her at home is now used as a defensive wall behind which artillery fires on the Japanese who are using the same bridge over which the young lovers had fled. The boat on which the couple escaped to their island has been transformed into a battleship, and the two doves are now dogfighting planes. This was a real, I mean, it was another New Yorker cover and got a lot of attention, or a lot of letters in saying, what is the point of this? And that's where they had to explain what this was about. This was at a time when they were making bike lanes in Manhattan and encouraging people for alternate ways of getting to work and not clogging the streets. It's quite a long time ago, and we're still doing it. And this was in celebration of the 75th? No, 100th. The centennial of the Brooklyn Bridge. So that's 1983. He did two versions. One is a daytime, one is a nighttime, and neither of them were published. So, for whatever reason, someone else's was. This, however, was, and there's the Twin Towers, all of it as in the aquarium. That one was also very unusual. People really they didn't know what to expect out of him anyway, so it didn't matter. New York. The Grand Central. You know. And again, I mean, look at the man, I don't know if you've ever done this, but I used to go to Grand Central from Connecticut. And those people inside that information booth were the most blasé, just uninterested in answering the question. The wrong job, just the wrong job. And that man is exactly what I remember seeing as a kid. Here comes the Addams family finally. This all happened in 1963. That one of his books had these characters in it. They were used as the cover of, I think, 11 of his books that he published. They weren't really a family. They were just odd characters thrown together, although they were children, but no one was necessarily the parents. This is pretty clear who the father and mother are here. And these two Hollywood producers were walking down the street and said, you know, we should do a TV show of this family. And they found out where Charlie was. They met him at the plaza, had drinks, and went home and did a contract. And that began the whole Addams family saga. This, however, is the very first cartoon that was of two of the characters that became the Addams family. This is Morticia and Lurch. And up there, that little character at the top of the stairs is Thing. So Thing was never a severed hand. Thing was a character that's in 35 of his cartoons. He was just a very shy character who never spoke, who witnessed everything, but you never saw anything more than from shoulders up. And if you can't read this is vibrationless, noiseless, and a great time and back saver. No well-appointed home should be without it. For sure, this is a well-appointed home. But look at how Lurch was. I mean, he was a real caveman gorilla. And I did meet the people in Brooklyn who own this, and there is all that white smudging behind there that looks like a different color white. He had a different character underneath that, and we really wanted to peel it up and see how it started, but I'm not going to do that. Anyway, he changed Lurch immediately after that. And Lurch, again, was not really Frankenstein. He honored Boris Karloff in one of his books, and Boris Karloff wrote an introduction to one of Charlie's cartoon books, but he was not referring to how wonderful he was in Frankenstein. It was how wonderful he was in a movie that came out a year after that, in which he played a deaf, drunk butler with criminal tendencies. And that's what that whole story. So everybody who has ever done this Frankenstein thing, it really has nothing to do with that. It's just that he had that similar look. Here is another one of Thing changing records. And this is where TV got the idea that, we don't have to have some little character that we only show part way up. We'll do this, put him in a box, and he can move around the house. This is very early of Grandma and Morticia, clearly not related, but may I borrow a cup of cyanide? And Morticia was very haggard, very a witch. She looked like a witch. And then she got more and more glamorous as time went by, and then Charlie was really revealing his whole fascination with that look, of that dark, eyes closely together look of a beautiful woman, sleek. And here's a perfect example of Hollywood, again, adapting the Addams Family. There's Morticia fondling flowers. So the TV program was going to try to replicate that, where he says, "You're in a strange mood today, I must say," because she would not normally do that. So instead, they have her cut all the blossoms off, because it wouldn't have really, they would have to over-explain it in a TV show, but to cut off the head says the same thing. Here's little Pugsley doing what Pugsley always did. He's probably the most torturing of all the family, actually. The little subversive boy. And here again, send the school bus out to the speeding train. Where Wednesday is a lot more contemplative. She appreciates the finer things, like bats going into her bat house. This is, "Don't come whining to me, go tell him you'll poison him right back." And this is, "It's the children, darling, back from camp." This got a lot of really bad mail. Children in pet carriers. First of all, people didn't know what they were, and they had to explain these are pet carriers. Again, there's Thing up at the top of the stairs looking through the balustrades, or the railings. This is, "Suddenly I have this dreadful urge to be merry" on Christmas. But again, I mean, it's a really, it looks good here, but in person, on exhibition, it's really extraordinary. His use of the grays. Everything he did was in en grisaille, which is just using the gray tones. He did 65 color covers, but he's known for this particular treatment. This is perhaps the most famous one of all, of boiling oil, which everyone in the world had a different attitude of what this meant. Is they pouring hot water on them? No, of course it's boiling oil. And that they hated Christians. That is not the message here. The message is they hated anybody invading their property. They don't care if they were Christians or not. That wasn't the point. And also how wholesome. And look how the light downstairs is all wonderful and warm and Christmas and all that and carolers. And then up there, it's dark and dank. And he just loved that. This is a shot of the, I'm just flashing off to now, right where we are with West Hampton Beach. The lower right are the stables of what was a huge estate in West Hampton Beach. So this is Dune Road, and Charlie owned both sides. So that little two-story building was a children's playhouse for some people further down Dune Road. And the girls had grown up, and the owner said, "If you would like this, you can have the house." So he got a barge and barged it around from the ocean side to this side and planted it in there. And that's where he had a studio. That's where he entertained a lot of lady friends. He loved being right there, and he had his little rowboat. We have the top of that Venetian post there in the backyard still. It was in the water, and I went out with a boat and dove down and got it out. It had rotted and collapsed. But that was a charming little house, and what you can't see is that all of that greenery on the right-hand side between the garage and the house is actually poison ivy. And in typical Addams fashion, he just encouraged it, had the gardener cut it back so it would contrain it, so it would get up to the second floor, and it kept people out because you had to duck under it to get into the house. It was really charming. And the only way to get to the second floor was either through a staircase around the front, or there was a little ladder built into the kitchen wall to get upstairs. it was a child's playhouse, and he played there heavily. This is where the foundation is currently housed, in their very modest Sagaponic house. It was one story all the way across with a little tiny guest house. Mrs. Addams said if my partner and I would come live there, she would build us a house. So it's a two-story section. That was a garage. Can I do this? Yes. This was a garage right here that separated the two buildings. So you walk through the laundry room to get to the main house. This is just a tent, so that's not part of the structure there. But it was wonderful. When she decided to do that, Charlie had died. She was afraid to live there alone. There's 100 acres of nature conservancy behind there and a stream. A couple of weird things happened there that really scared her. And so she said, if I build this for you, will you guys come live here? And then we could do our landscaping from there. T and I had been friends for all those years anyway, so it just was it was a perfect thing to do. We didn't think we'd be there all now today as well, but we are. Charlie came home from a nice weekend in September 1988, having been over in Guilford, Connecticut with friends, and just slumped over in his car. And they found him and took him to the hospital, and he died there. So I think it must be 10 years later we finally did this. I mean, his ashes kind of moved around. They were in New York for 4 or 5 years until we realized that when we would go into New York and use the apartment, that what was up on the shelf was the Frank Campbell box. And it was sort of, T didn't want anything to do with that, and we didn't understand that or really know that, but we eventually said, T, what would you like to do? Well, we should, I've always wanted to have a pet cemetery like the one I had, and there had just been jars sitting on the side of the driveway that had been moved from Watermill. So we landscaped this and made finally a pet cemetery where we could inter. Charlie is underneath the obelisk, which he got in an antique store in Maine, which really is a child's cemetery piece. It says Our Little Orville on it. And T is under the sleeping fox. So we finally do have them where they both belong. And we were permitted to do this. You can in Suffolk County as long as you don't sell plots. And I don't think we're going to be selling any plots. I'll give you this last photo of Charlie at his drawing table. And this is in that second floor of the West Hampton Beach place. So he looked right out at the canal that flows, just parallel to the ocean. It's kind of a really sweet picture of him actually working there, considering he said he never worked at the West Hampton Beach. That was his playhouse. That's about it. I'm sure you must have questions, or maybe you don't. Maybe I answered everything. I doubt it. Anything? Anybody? Yes? Oh, that's a good point. He went to college, 3 different colleges, 1 year each. Really, his training was only at Grand Central School of Artists, and that's it. The other 2 were not. Colgate and Penn, where he didn't know what to do. I think he thought he was going to be an architect, something in that realm, because he had always done it as a child. He drew so much that it didn't seem out of the ordinary that he would try to go someplace and design. He was fascinated with buildings and all of that. But it never panned out. He really wanted to get into New York and get a job at the New Yorker, period. So his last school was Grand Central, and that sewed it up. Yes? No. We're not sure why, because it could be that he was sterile. He certainly had enough opportunities to breed. Quite frankly, there were a lot of women. We have all his little black books that men used to carry. No. I don't know why. That's really funny. But no, that's why I think we think, including T. I mean, I think she believed that too. She never asked him.
And I live here, my son goes to high school here. Do you do any kind of programming at all for?
We do cartooning classes through Bridgehampton Museum. We have for years. He knew nothing of the foundation because T and I didn't form it until 3 years after his death, or no, 10 years after his death. But we do cartooning classes through the auspices of the Bridgehampton Historical Society, which is now the Bridgehampton Museum. So they do 2-week-long programs, one in July, one in August. We exhibited them when the Children's Museum, when we were in functioning position with the Children's Museum, we would have exhibitions of the children's work alongside of Charlie's work. So it was really a thrill. That's kind of stopped, where they don't even exhibit it at the Historical Society. So we'll see what we do with this a little further. I'd like to spread it a little further to inner city situations too, which we just haven't, the we is me. So I haven't really gotten there yet, but we need to do this. Yes, sir?
What did he think of the television show, and how did he interact with it?
He didn't care particularly. He was an artist. He was a cartoonist. He was on to the next drawing. He was not plugged into this. He did go out twice, and he was friendly with Carolyn Jones in the respect of just being in touch with each other. There was no email. There were little notes back and forth. He was much closer to John Aston, and a little bit with Jackie Coogan too. By the time the movies came around, he had died, so he was there for the signing of the contract, but by the time that all happened, it was 2 years later. So his interest, he was fascinated. What he didn't like is that they named it the Addams Family. That was not a place that was comfortable. He was a behind-the-scenes kind of man. He had very soft-spoken, covered a bit of a lisp, probably his entire life, and had this incredibly sparkly pair of sparkling eyes. And I think that was it was like a little boy inside a man's body, and that's why he had all these women just falling over themselves. We have some letters that would, at the time you could send a letter across town in New York in the morning and they would get it in the afternoon. And it said, Jack is out of town until Thursday and stuff. It's like, wow. And he saved all that stuff, so I can say this. Yes?
What about with animals?
Yeah, he had a dog. Oh, thank you. That brings up an interesting little story. They both loved animals. In fact, his first wife, Barbara, did too. We spent a couple of years seeing her in the Keys, and they always had some sort of dog or cat. But when Charlie was alone, before the last marriage, he went to Bidewee in West Hampton Beach, and he said he would really like to see what dogs they had. And way, way, way down at the end of the hall was this dog, jumping in the cage. And he said, "What about that dog down there?" And they said, "Oh no, Mr. Addams, you won't like that dog. That dog bites children." and he said, "I'll take her." and probably after about 5 or 6 years, Alice was and he named her Alice B. Kerr, ABC, Alice B. Kerr. She became wider and wider and wider. I can remember she was like an ottoman on legs. She tortured him so badly because he worked at home. He didn't go to the New Yorker to work. He would do everything at his studio at home and then go in for meetings and things like that, get approvals. So Alice was eating dinner at 1 in the afternoon. By the time she was getting really big, she just tortured him. And then he'd have to take her out for a walk, and it was a wonderful relationship. When Alice died, he was heartbroken. He never wanted another animal. T had plenty of dogs. She took ARF dogs home. That's what all the people who started ARF did. They went and rescued animals and kept them at their homes before the ARF Adoption Center was built. So, else? Yes, back.
This new project that's happening that I hear about, movie and all this stuff.
Yes, there's an animated film. After all this, we did do a musical in 2010 that lasted a couple of years on Broadway. It was really fun. It was sweet. It's still traveling the world, and it's also, this is the fourth year in a row that it's the #1 production for school groups for a musical. It's just amazing. And from that came, not really from that, 8 years ago, almost 9 years ago, we had a license with Universal, and they were going to do the Addams Family. I had the position of having script approval, etc., and they could never come up with a script. So then 4.5, 5 years ago, MGM picked it up because Universal exhausted that contract. And so MGM is the one who did come through, and that's the movie that came out last weekend to the tune of $30.2 million gross for an opening weekend. So it was the second highest film, instead of what the Will Smith movie was supposed to be the one. And it didn't. The Joker did, but the Joker was around the world already. So we'll see what this does. They've already announced that, we're going to do the sequel, and we'll see about that. I'm also working with MGM to do a TV program about Wednesday Addams. It is the Me Too hashtag time. She could be a great spokesman for the darker side, but the practical smarty pants side too. So we'll see what this boils down to. If the writing is, I hope the writing's good. Otherwise, I really don't want to see it happen. But that's what's happened just with the Addams Family, which is allowing us to do everything we do, not for profit, to ship art, never charge anybody. We've got exhibitions going all the time here, and it's finally hitting the Midwest. It's in Michigan right now. There's a big show in Saginaw at the Art Museum. We've never been any closer to. It's always been bi-coastal, as far away as Australia, but not in the middle of the country except in Chicago when the musical was being tried out in 2009. So things perhaps are changing, and maybe it takes the movie to build the village. I don't know. Yes?
Was there something unique about his childhood that took him in the direction of such a dark sense of humor?
He had a really warm, attentive mother and father. A father who was a piano organ salesman, so he was gone a lot. So he was raised a lot by a mother and an aunt who encouraged his art, who encouraged his ability. We have drawings of him that he did when he was 3 and 4 years old of trains and fascination with machinery. World War I had happened. He did all the soldiers and their costumery. So, it's not surprising that he would be attracted to knights of armor and suits and weaponry, and all they did is change costumes from one war to the other. It was the same thing. We're still doing it. We're killing each other and just wear different clothes. So his fascination with that darkness had a lot to do with the Gothic neighborhood. Westfield also had a couple of very strange residents. There's, murder houses and things like that there that you can look up online and see. It still is a fascination. Right now they have the Addams Fest in Westfield for a whole month. And there's all sorts of activities that go on. And all the children have painted all the store windows in town with Addams Family characters. It's just extraordinary. I think they have a Halloween ball this weekend. So Westfield has grabbed onto this concept of using Charlie as a good hook to unify their town, which has been sort of split. It's a strange little place. It's almost Stepford Wives place, which if anyone's from Westfield, I'm sorry. But it is bizarre. It's tucked in behind Elizabeth, sort of in a strange spot. But it's a beautiful town. I have no real deep explanation for that, but that's about as close as we can get. He had to pass a cemetery and pass a lot of haunted houses, and I think his structural brain that was so interested in architecture probably caused him to follow that even further. In Westfield, they also have a skeleton that he did on the inside of someone's barn that's probably 6-7 feet tall, and its name is Dudley. The people who owned the estate said to the town of Westfield, if you salvage it, you may have it. So they've had it cut out and framed and put onto the barn wood, and it's part of town hall in Westfield. Yes?
Was there a particular house that he got his inspiration for the, so that in a lot of his cartoons, there's this really creepy mansion that,
Right.
and I always noticed there used to be a house in Bridgehampton.
Yes. We have photographs of that fire when they burned it down in the 71, I think. That was not far from where the foundation's house is. But, we probably have a couple hundred photographs from people. Here's the Addams house. Here's the Addams house. Key West. Bellevue, Washington. I mean, any house that looks like that sort of gets it. You have to kind of give him credit that there wasn't an inspiration of one house. He was an artist. But he did have a really good friend at the New York Times. Before it became the living section, she had access to all the files, which had every window, every bed frame, all Gothic materials, stained glass windows, everything you can imagine. So Charlie kind of pieced them together. I'm sure that there were houses that were similar. And the one in Bridgehampton is pretty close. I mean, even to the shingling that has that clamshell kind of look that he was favoring. But he didn't copy anything any more than he based Morticia on one particular woman. I think it was a look he enjoyed, and he grew up with it, so he made up his own tower and turrets and things that went on. A few of our drawings that have never been published show the backside of a house, which you never get to see. So they were just kind of just a flat wall, with some broken windows. But I don't think he really did base it on anything in particular. He did mention that house being burned, though. That was interesting because he always wanted to go in the house and go like he had as a child. He didn't have the opportunity. Anyone else? Hey, thank you very much. It's fun.